This is a notice for all participants. This is a public meeting and proceedings are being webcast live online. A recording will also be available for playback on the Council's website shortly afterwards. Please note that your name will appear in the live stream and in the recording. Should you not wish for your image to appear on these, please turn off your camera. Third parties should not record or film the local plan hearing sessions, and neither the Council nor the Planning Inspectorate are liable for any third-party recordings. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 o'clock, so time for us to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells Borough Local Plan. Welcome back for this afternoon's session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matthew Birkinshaw, Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to hold the examination. This afternoon, we are moving on to the last scheduled hearing session. We've got an additional session tomorrow. But this is the last scheduled hearing session. We're on to matter 15, so we're looking at the natural environment policy and again going through the development management policies within the plan. I'll quickly run through the technology. So I think there's maybe a couple of new names on the participants list today who haven't attended previous sessions. So I'll very quickly run through how the hearing is going to work. So there's no set agenda for today, so we'll run through the matters, issues and questions document, which has previously been circulated, and people have submitted hearing statements in response to that. So we're on to matter 15 and looking at the issues there, predominantly around environmental protection and biodiversity net gain. We'll go through matters, issues and questions. I'll sort of lead the discussion and ask questions of the council. If at any stage people would like to participate, if you just use the raise hand function within Zoom and let me know that you wish to speak, I can then sort of bring you into the discussion. If it's the first time that you've participated, if you could just introduce yourself, let me know who you are, if you're acting on behalf of a particular parish council or particular group or landowner or just local residents, that'd be much appreciated. And again, turn your camera and microphone on at that stage, and then once you've finished speaking, if you can turn the camera and microphone off, that'd be much appreciated. As per the sessions, then we'll go through the matters, issues, and questions. I do obviously welcome and encourage the debate and discussion around some of these policies and some of these issues, but please do stick to the representations that you've made. So the representations you made in response to the submission plan. Obviously, the hearings are an opportunity for you to put your points forward, but based on those representations, so not to introduce any new points or discuss any policies which you haven't previously raised points on. So that's a very quick run through. Appreciate several of you have been at several of these sessions now, so obviously aware of how things work. Anything from the council before we get going?
No, thank you, sir.
No, very good. Okay, so the first topic for discussion this afternoon then is around biodiversity net gain, and really the introduction to this is set out in question 1, which is essentially then what is the justification for the requirement in policy EN9 that requires a minimum 10% net gain from developments?
Thank you, sir. David Scully, Landscape and Biodiversity Officer at Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. So policy has moved from a national and local policy, moved from a position of no net loss to a net gain. And the question is, how do we try and achieve a gain and measure it? we've sought to work with the emerging legislation and government guidance, and we're aligned with the now published Environment Act, which sets out the relevant percentage as 10%. 10% might be considered by some a very low percentage, given the amount of uncertainty perhaps over the metric, it being fairly new, but also in terms of the challenge that the natural environment faces currently. But we do believe 10% is appropriate. It follows all the current thinking and guidance, and also it has been viability tested through our plan and through national viability testing as well. And so we set out clearly in our response to statement 1 why 10% is currently appropriate.
Within policy EN9, it refers to, obviously refers to this issue, it refers to biodiversity net gain. It states that Part B, the percentage of net gain shall be a minimum of 10% as required by legislation or greater where required by supplementary planning guidance. What does that mean?
Sure, so we'll, bearing in mind the comments you've made previously about supplementary planning guidance, we do need to make sure that it is properly referenced, and that is a challenge for us in this situation. The reason for leaving the door open, if you like, for an increase is really twofold. So firstly, we have been challenged on the percentage, otherwise we're not going for a high percentage, including by Natural England. In our discussions, we've been working very closely with a group called Kent Nature Partnership, which includes developers, various statutory bodies, Natural England, etc., to look at the needs and requirements and possibilities within Kent and in the borough. And we have looked at a variety of combinations for this policy over a period of 3 or 4 years, in fact, trying to understand the legislation and what's required. The legislation is a minimum. So the argument put forward by Natural England was that, well, it's a minimum, so you can ask for more where there's a justification. And clearly, we eventually came down on the views that we couldn't at this stage ask for more than 10% unless we had the evidence to support that. The first part of that evidence is about viability. The second part is about whether, you know, the appropriate areas of land and so on are available and can be delivered. The first part of the viability study has been completed by Kent. We need to review that, but it also has to be looked at afresh locally as well. So that piece of work has yet to be done. So the difficulty we face is that we feel there is a justification for greater than 10%, both in terms of the crisis that the natural environment faces, but also in terms of the viability of a greater increase. But at this stage, we cannot provide the evidence for it, and would only ask for that increase if we do have the evidence. It is unusual, I agree, that SPDs have measures like this in, but it's not unheard of. Other SPDs in related to provision of natural space or in relation to housing and so on may well change certain requirements as evidence comes forward and monitoring comes forward. So we would like the opportunity to have this option available to us, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Certainly, I'm aware in relation to both the supporting text and the policy, certain aspects need to have regard to the supplementary planning guidance rather than comply with it.
Yeah, we'll see some views on this, but this goes back to sort of the reoccurring theme, doesn't it, about policy requirements should be clearly set out in the development plan. So again, developers, decision makers, local communities know what is required. Changing things through SPG, supplementary planning guidance, supplementary planning documents, they wouldn't have the same processes as a development plan document. So in that regard, I was certainly I don't think you could specify something as a 10% requirement and then potentially could be subject to change. You could change that through a development plan document. You could change that through a partial review of your local plan as and when the evidence has been produced, including viability evidence. But I think it falls into the same, or something. See people's views on this, but I think it probably falls into the same category of what we've been talking about sort of throughout this examination on other policies.
That's helpful, sir. I think there is a distinction between the information we wish to cover in a supplementary planning document, which is about the detail needed to implement the policy, which is appropriate for a supplementary planning document, and the need to review the percentage, which, as you say, therefore needs to be a development plan document. And perhaps we could make that distinction. And that would also, I think, go to the monitoring issue that's been raised in terms of funding as well. Such a matter would probably have to be covered by a development plan document. So we can make reference to a future development plan document to cover those issues if that proves necessary.
And I think with this, obviously, it is still relatively new, and the council over the sort of coming months and years will, this will become obviously more common and used as well. So, it may be that it needs some time to sort of bed in and see how these things actually work through the sort of management and monitoring process. So.
Yes, sir. We are still waiting the secondary legislation, but we do have a couple of years' experience of delivering net gain and of requiring 10%, and that's been successful and is working very well. Developers are now all clued up in our area, as are their consultants. We've worked with Metric 2, Metric 3, and more recently Metric 3.1. We've even had some small site metrics submitted. So yes, we're very, what you might call an early adopter.
The same goes for the sort of part A of the policy as well, doesn't it? So net gain should be provided on or adjacent to the site wherever possible, and where provided off-site in terms of location and type, be in accordance with the supporting text or as otherwise required by supplementary planning guidance. So again, it's just making it clear what's required in the policy, and then yes, your SPG and your supplementary text can expand upon that. As it does for other policies, what we've talked about today, design and residential amenity and things like that, where you've got your SPGs, but the main requirements of the policy should be set out in the development plan.
Yeah, those refreshers will be made throughout the plan, and as long as you're happy with the 10% as a minimum requirement, and we're happy.
Okay, let's take some views on this, be it the sort of the headline figure, and then second to that, sort of how this is sort of worked out in practice then. So we'll go to David Lovell, please, first.
Yes, hello, I'm on here for Save Capel. I'm the biodiversity team lead. Firstly, I hope, sir, that you've had a chance to review Save Capel's biodiversity report, which lists the wide variety of biodiversity in our parish. I don't want to list all of that, it's there for you to read. But to the question, the answer is that the council have gone for the minimum 10% because that's what was likely to be required and now is. They were encouraged by Natural England, as they've mentioned, to go higher, but decided not to despite recognising the biodiversity crisis here. They claim there's a lack of evidence that development is viable. If biodiversity net gain was to go above 10%, although that's clearly not the case now, and insufficient land might be available. But we're also told that BNG costs next to nothing in their response to question 2, and that the landowner for Toodley, at least, we are told, owns significant areas that can be put aside for BNG. So I'm not sure why they're finding that evidence is lacking. We've heard that they're claiming that they're going to leave the door open to increasing BNG in yet another supplementary planning document, but they can't consider a higher percentage because they have to review a Kent-wide viability assessment, which again is supported by Natural England. However, that report, which is out, also shows that costs are small. Additional costs, for example, above the 10% baseline for on-site BNG alone, 500 units on greenfield at 15% costs around £85 per unit. At 20% is 216. Interestingly, on brownfield sites, which unfortunately are far from the core strategy of the local plan, that number is even less for 500 units, 15% an extra £12 and 20% an extra 27. So in other words, the council really could do better on BNG, far better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? If not, I'll hand back to Mr. Scully if you did want to come back on anything you've heard.
I'd just say, sir, the Kent viability report was actually instigated pretty much at our request, because Kent was suggesting a 20%, and we said we do need the evidence. We managed to persuade Natural England to partly fund that. The final report's only just been published. We've been in contact with the consultants who did that report about reviewing it in relation to Tunbridge Wells Borough. That appears to be a very expensive exercise. We're looking at how we do that. We are, say, an early adopter. Most of the councils in Kent and even locally are not insisting upon net gain at the moment. They're waiting for the legislation to come in 2023. And I note a number of representatives have suggested that's what we do. We're not prepared to do that. We recognise the existing emergency, and we're doing all that we can through this plan to deliver an important gain for biodiversity. And we're being very strict about the way in which it's applied and the guidance is applied.
In terms of actually meeting the requirements then, let's just quickly look at the policy then. So net gain should be provided on or adjacent to the site wherever possible, and where provided off-site shall, in terms of the location type, be in accordance with the supporting text. So we've talked about this already. So where it's provided off-site then, what either have you been doing as a council, or what would you expect developers to do where the requirements are provided off-site?
So at the moment, they're required to provide a scheme in accordance with the sort of DEFRA guidance or SEMA guidance. We have an interim scheme in place, which is allowing development to go forward, and that has a limited shelf life. We've already been looking at how we would deliver further off-site provision, and how that's part of the work that we're doing with the Kent Nature Partnership, because there are arguments about how local it should be, whether all the money should go into local, or whether some of it should go into, or the net gain should go into strategic, what those provisions should be, how they might relate to nature recovery strategies, and so forth. We have been contacted and been in contact with a number of landowners who are preparing land to provide biodiversity net gain credits within the county and locally. There is potential for some developers' sites to over-provide on their site, in which case those units can be available to other developers. So we've been, say, a lead authority in this work, and that's why we have quite a detailed arrangement set out in the LDS for delivering the supplementary planning guidance, because not only will it specify how the submissions are carried out, it'll also detail and provide guidance and clarity on how the off-site contributions will be met. So we're working quite hard on that, and so far there has been no impediment to delivery. At the end of the day, as pointed out by one of the respondents, there is a national scheme being drawn up that would allow people where there is no local options to buy national credit. But already we have a company called Environment Bank working in the area who are able to provide that in any case. What's important to us as a borough is that the available guidance is followed in terms of trying to deliver things on site, and if that's not possible, trying to deliver things locally, but always making sure it's appropriate. So there is no impediment to development by introducing this policy. It's a sort of cascade effect, if you like, in terms of local first, and then wider opportunities are available.
In terms of the, obviously this would apply to all development then, presumably, will it?
Yes, sir. Again, that's where an SPD can be really helpful to provide a simpler strategy for perhaps smaller scale development. Natural England has introduced the small scale scheme metric, which is helpful. But there is, I think, a need to provide people with a clearer guidance, particularly for smaller development, and to make it easier for them to meet the policy requirements. And the SPD will address issues like that, if you like, the gaps in the guidance and legislation. So for the site allocations within the plan, then I think that's one question. Two, I think that I asked, where you've proposed allocations, did you consider at the draft allocation stage whether or not policies like this could be achieved, or was it just more, well, it would be a requirement of those developments, and ultimately it would be a development plan policy and they'd have to meet it, so it'd be addressed, further down the line? To be honest, I'd say it was a bit of both. This has been emerging policy. We have, as you've seen, with our sites, allocated significant green space within those, and that follows the experience that we've had with some of those applications coming forward, delivering on site the policy requirement or above. I've set out a number of schemes that have come through, some dating from 2018 and 2019 and 2020, where this policy has been emerging. We've put in place the interim measure, and by relying on the MPPF, we've managed to deliver net gain both on and off site. It is at allocation stage quite difficult to run the metric. It is possible at outline stage once you've got some idea, but that's why the policy is framed in it is, in that you follow the mitigation hierarchy, you then deliver on site if you can, and then you deliver off site. With some small sites, and that, again, there's a reference in the policy to where the outcome for biodiversity is better to deliver it off-site, because some sites are so small and isolated that any provision on-site would be not particularly valuable, and it'd be better to provide that through an off-site scheme. So we have followed and updated this to reflect the what's in the legislation, and believe that this council will deliver through its allocations 10% or more net gain.
Okay, thank you. They're the only questions that I had. Unless anybody else would like to make any comments then about the remainder of this policy, its effectiveness, how it will work, its justification. Yeah, Mr. Lovell.
Yeah, there's a couple of points here that concern me. One is whether the policies that they're introducing here will be like for like, or whether they're just happy for BNG to be achieved regardless of where that takes place. I mean, there's no point suggesting better woodland management will suffice for BNG in the strategic sites, for example, as the council did back in 2019, when actually it's fields that are going to disappear. So, you know, that it's important that like for like is taken account of. So fields and orchards of Capel flush with red list birds like skylarks and linnets, replacing their habitat with one that encourages sort of more common garden birds like blackbirds and blue tits is really not going to help. I'd also sort of like the council say that they've been successful in introducing BNG for the last couple of years. And in their response to your question, they have 7 sites where at least BNG of 10% was achieved. However, the outcomes all seem to me to be rather assumptive or not proven. Where is the actual evidence? What are the species that have gained against those that have lost out? If BNG is to mean anything other than a cosmetic exercise for developers, then the data should be out there. I mean, if I've missed it, I'd very much like to see it.
Okay, anything the council want to respond on, or any other comments?
Just for the benefit of Mr. Lovell, sir, these figures are based on submitted DEFRA metrics and ecological surveys and assessments, detailed ecological assessments. The metric itself doesn't cover species. They're covered by separate legislation and do have to be dealt with separately and taken account of. And I would agree with him, we need to look at particular species. We've been talking to all the developers around Paddock Wood, for instance, for doing turtle dove friendly zones, because that's a target species for that area. In terms of how it's proven, say the metric itself deals with particular habitats. For instance, it won't allow trading down. If you're affecting a higher quality habitat, you can't provide a lower quality habitat in its replacement. It also deals with the particular habitat types, and you should be providing, if you like, a sort of equal quality habitat and types. And also you can't mix and match between linear habitats, area habitats and river habitats. They have to be done independently. So all that is set out in the guidance. It's very, very comprehensive. It runs to probably hundreds of pages. The metrics themselves are very complicated and are very detailed, and they do get submitted to the local authority and subject to scrutiny.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll move on then, because obviously there's sort of several of these environmental sort of protection policies, and we'll go through these and look at some of these in greater detail then. So that was policy EN9, which is all about biodiversity net gain. Policy EN10, which is really sort of next in the list if we go through them. Again, I didn't have any specific questions on EN10, but happy to hear from others who may, if anybody's made any representations on this policy. No. So that's EN10. EN11 was around special protection area, Ashdown Forest. We talked about this in the context of habitat regulations all the way back on the very first day, I think, on the Matter 1. So there will be some sort of crossover. There's a question 3 within the Matters, Issues and Questions, which relates to policy EN11, and this is the sort of 7-kilometre zone. there was reference back in the sort of early stage of the examination about potential alterations to that zone. And this is the sort of defined zone of influence as it's called. And I think it's figure 8 within the plan. So it's a 7-kilometre zone of influence around Ashdown Forest, which crosses into Tunbridge Wells Borough. There was discussion back at the earlier stage of the examination about potential changes to that boundary. Is it worthwhile just picking up on that again? So in terms of any changes, is anything in the pipeline to change that boundary, or is it fairly fixed?
So it is fairly fixed based on all the available evidence as supported by Natural England, and there's been no requests for changes. However, it is something that in the future may well change, subject to the evidence. There is no plan change. It's not anticipated it would change in the foreseeable future, but that has to be acknowledged. There was some discussion at the previous hearing stage about the latest visitor survey not being published or not being available. As I said at the time, we do not rely upon that survey for our HRA. However, that survey has since been published. It was published, I think this week or last week, by Wealdon District Council as part of their plan making process, because it had got to a stage where all the authorities had agreed it, and they were, if you like, the commissioning agent for that study, and so it has now been published. Our review of it showed that no change was necessary. Natural England haven't asked for a change, and nobody else has asked for a change. We have, or I've certainly requested it be uploaded to our website on the Ashdown Forest Protection page, so it's there for everybody to see. I'm not sure if that's happened yet, but I can advise you if, and indeed provide you a link if that will be helpful to you.
Yep, I think if that can be provided, that'd be much appreciated, because it was referred to back in the early stages of the examination, wasn't it? And it was something that was specifically discussed. So if that's now a publicly available document, then it makes sense to be made available.
Would you like it to be a hearing document, sir?
It can be added to the, yes, if you can forward it to the programme officer and it can be added.
Thank you.
Looking at the specifically at the way in which the policy works then, so policy EN 11 refers to all development resulting in a net increase in housing within this 7-kilometre zone. Will provide a strategic access management and monitoring and a suitable alternative natural green space contribution to address the impacts of visitors from new development on the forest. So just in terms of this contribution then, how does that work at the moment? Because I appreciate that it's a relatively, a very small area really in the context of the borough, but how has that worked previously in terms of what the actual financial contribution is?
You're right, sir. It's a very, very small area, and we've consistently worked with the various groups in Natural England to support a strategic approach to Ashdown Forest, even though it only affects a relatively small part of the borough. In fact, we've been very instrumental in a lot of the work that's gone on, along with 2 or 3 other authorities. So we work very closely on this work. How it works, and we've only had one application for us, and that was a conversion so far in the last 5 years for a new residential property, and we simply took a contribution for SAMs on that, because at the time Natural England weren't asking for SANGs or hadn't made it clear. They've now asked for SAMs and SANGs, and they've taken that approach also with any other authority with even a very small area within their district. So that would apply equally to Sevenoaks, who would are in a similar situation to ourselves, and they've been notified of that. So the SAMS payment is part of a legal agreement we have between the affected authorities, and it's set out in the various documents on the website as to how that's applied. There's a tariff based on a projected management program and a scheme of implementation, which we work together with the Ashdown Forest Conservators. In terms of SANGs, that will have to be provided. Well, not have to be, but the agreement at the moment and the discussions we've had Natural England is that it's better to work with the other authorities who are providing SANGs and to seek capacity within their SANG sites. So the cost of that varies. It will depend upon what SANG sites are being provided, by whom and when, in relation to any particular application. So we would contact the adjoining authorities through our partnership, talk about applications that are coming in and agree where that SANGs can be provided. You'll see that that's in the, we discussed this briefly at the previous session. There's agreement to have those discussions with Wilton District and indeed Mid Sussex actually, on how that will be provided.
So what you just told me, is that set out anywhere then? Just going again, if there was an application that came forward in this area, would they know?
Yes, sir. So there's a link there to the council's practice note and the agreements, and that's all on the website. So in addition to the practice note, it sets out all the legal agreements, the visitor surveys, and so on. So it's absolutely clear what is required. Just let me just check what we put into the original statement for you on that. I think, sir, we have actually, just looking at this policy now, where the practice note has been updated to 2021, and we've provided a link. So in accordance with the statements we gave to you for matter 1, issue 2, where we said that was being provided, we will update this policy to make sure it provides the correct references to the available documents and guidance, and consider that. But that's is all that needs to be done.
Okay, yeah, and then we talked about the final part of the policy, didn't we?
Yeah.
Which was potential, potential revisions, etc.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions then on this? Obviously, appreciate that it applies to a sort of very small part of the borough. I think you said it had one plan application in 5 years, but nevertheless is a requirement and still important. So, any representations or comments on this policy? Anybody? Okay, we'll move on. Policy EN12 then. There's a question about some of the wording in their proposals adversely affecting, but no, that's fine. You set out how that would work in your hearing statement. One issue that I do want to pick up on, which has been raised in the various representations, is this issue, and we've discussed it actually quite a lot in terms of the site allocations. This issue of the 25-metre buffer zone then that's referred to, it's actually referred to in the supporting text, I think. Let me just search the relevant page.
That's correct. So the buffer's referred to in the supporting text.
Yeah, it's 6.171. It's in the supporting text. It talks about ancient woodlands and veteran trees, etc. And it says that in the absence of site surveys and detailed assessments, the council will assume a buffer of 25 metres from the edge of the woodlands, which allows the presence of veteran trees and the fall height of mature trees. We've talked about this a lot, and in the context of the site allocations, and on previous days, I think the council's made it clear that this 25 meters, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not a sort of default, there shall always be a 25 meter buffer zone. This is, and I think you emphasised this point in previous sessions, that this is in the absence of any specific site surveys and information. And clearly it would be incumbent upon a developer to carry out the necessary, surveys and if a different distance, be that, smaller or greater, was necessary, then that's what would be used.
That's correct, sir. And I can't stress enough the importance of retaining this kind of reference in here. It is continually frustrating to be met with development proposals that default to 15 metres and do no work whatsoever, which puts the council in a difficult position when it's set out in Natural England guidance, which they then rely upon, even though the guidance, and we've set out quite clearly what the guidance actually says. It is important, I think, to set this out for developers. If they aren't going to be prepared to do the work, then this is an appropriate distance to make an assumption on, taking account of just normal characteristics of ancient woodland. And again, based on the likely distances required for veteran trees. You'll see in the statement at 3.2, the Natural England guidance actually talks about the buffers required for for veteran trees, 15 times larger than the diameter of a tree. So if it's even just 1.5 meters diameter, you're talking about 22.5 meters minimum. So we think this is a sensible addition and approach to ancient woodland, and we have a lot of ancient woodland. So we have a great responsibility for addressing this, and it commonly occurs on a great many development sites.
So where's this referred to in the policy or the requirement then? Let's have a quick look at the policy. Where do we go to consider this in the actual policy wording itself? Is there anything in there?
Sorry, sir, it's in policy EN 13 rather than EN 12, and it's criterion 5, provision of adequate buffers. I would be more than happy if you think it's appropriate to add in a caveat there that in the absence of a survey that the 25 meters would be assumed.
So you've got provision of adequate buffers, and then the supporting text refers to the 25 meters. So let's have a look at the supporting text, and it goes on to the council expects developers through assessments to confirm that this or any other distance is appropriate. I think it's probably fine. I think it's clear that it's because the 25 meters is like I say, it's a sort of default in the absence of site surveys and information. The policies is probably okay as written. Like I say, you've justified it. It's not a sort of a default 25 meters in every situation. It's incumbent upon the developer to provide the necessary information which could reduce that buffer accordingly. So
yes,
no,
I appreciate it. I'm grateful the fact that you find it satisfactory as it is, but I do wonder if actually adding it to the policy in the way it's expressed in the supporting text would ensure that it hits home and has the desired effect.
It's difficult. Would it improve the policy? Probably. Is it unsound? That's the problem. in terms of sort of my scope of changing policies can only be changed where there's a soundness issue. It's probably okay, to be honest. Ultimately, if a scheme didn't provide an adequate buffer, then it'd be refused against that requirement.
No, that's fine, sir. It's worth a try.
Yeah, Mr. Lovell.
Yeah, I take the council's point here, and I think it's laudable that they want to impose to have a larger buffer. But I agree. I think it's difficult for them, and not much notice is being taken by developers. They try and reduce that further, and I think that applies to some of the other things that the council listed in response to this question to try and protect ancient woodland and the environment. Some of the developers seem to take that very much for granted. And I noticed that Claire Riley from the PWTC Council says she'd probably go to give an example of Folehurst Wood, where a development has been put pretty much up to a very sensitive site and effectively will become a cat's larder. This will apply again equally to Toodley, where the main hub of the development is adjacent to the central area of ancient woodland, but the sole linking corridor is dissected by roads, isolating the woodland, which currently harbours roosting bats. East Capel also has a significant area of ancient woodland that will be impacted. And so there needs to be some form of compliance that can be sort of brought to bear on developers. But unfortunately, there doesn't actually seem to be a governance mechanism that can be brought to bear on people who default on this. This was an omission that was noted by the Durrell Institute in a report of December 2020, which was mentioned in the Save Capel Biodiversity report. Tunbridge Wells was included in this report, but it's sceptical about councils generally, their ability to hold developers to account. It says here, unfortunately, our analysis also shows that the governance might not be there to ensure these promises are kept for habitats delivered within the footprints of proposed developments. So the council need to bring something forward. Again, we've already heard you mentioned this morning where our receipts for local builders are going to be kept. I imagine it's very resource intensive. But what are the council going to do to try and enforce the promises that developers are making? Thank you.
Just to go back to that point on this buffer, and it sort of just goes back to the point that Mr. Lovell made in some regard. If you look at policy EN 13, so this provision of buffers and provision of adequate evidence to support development proposals is under points 5 and 6. The way the policy is worded, it says the following principles should be used to guide both the site selection and the design of development. Rather than putting the 25 metres into the policy, because it is a sort of, let's say it be based on site considerations, whether or not you probably could, in terms of the effectiveness of the policy, make that stronger in terms of, no, you are requiring the provision of adequate buffers, and you are requiring the provision of adequate evidence to support and substantiate those buffers. So maybe that would be the way of doing it, and making it abundantly clear that it's not just these are sort of nice things that will help guide your developments. These are policy requirements. These are absolutely necessary.
So that last sentence before the criteria, the end of that sentence, you're thinking that should be more about the following are required.
Well, it's where development proposals may affect ancient woodlands. Let's have a look. or alternatively, your points 5 and 6. Points 1 to 4 are sort of quite sort of high level, aren't they? They are sort of guiding principles, avoidance of harm. And I wonder whether points 5 and 6, you could just make them a sort of standalone sentence along the lines of, these, this is what will be required. So development must provide.
Development must, yes.
Must provide adequate buffers as evidenced by adequate supporting information, or something like that. And then you sort of you're almost doing away with this reliance on meters and saying, well, ultimately, if you've not justified it, then you're not providing the adequate buffers, then it would be, it'd be contrary to the policy. And then that potentially then really sort of puts the emphasis on applicants to do this, obviously in applicable sites. And I don't know, just thinking out loud, that might address the issues that we're facing.
No, I think that's a really good idea, sir. And I think we could probably just also add, some adequate supporting information in, reference to the Natural England Standing Advice. But yeah, I think that doing it that way is I think really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's something that I'd support in terms of effectiveness, because then it's a clear policy requirement, and equally for developers, it doesn't make development more onerous. It's something that presumably the majority of developers will be well aware of when they're promoting sites adjacent to ancient woodland and veteran trees, that they'd be supported by an appropriate tree survey. Ms. Riley?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, the Peckham Town Council would definitely support this policy being as strong as possible. We appreciate Mr. Scully's efforts to make it so. We have got areas of ancient woodland where we found that the attritional effect on mature tree species of very close development has had a really bad effect on the trees, despite us owning the bits of land and managing the woodland very, very actively. Over a period of time, the trees die off and you lose the wildlife that's in them. I would say, with reference to Folhurst Wood and the Barklands development, we did manage to negotiate directly with the developer, who were very responsible, and they were happy to negotiate directly with us, and we agreed with them a very substantial buffer zone, which I think was probably more than 25 metres, to protect the nature reserve. There's still been issues with behaviour once residents have moved in, but we were also, apart from the buffer zone, we were also able to negotiate having vegetation barriers and cat-proof fencing and that sort of thing to stop cats and dogs and so forth getting into the nature reserve. So that's an example of where a policy has worked in cooperation with the developers rather than where it's failed. We have other areas where effectively the woodland is slowly degrading, the mature tree species are dying back, and we're effectively losing the ancient woodland. But that's where there isn't the sufficient buffer zone, and as I say, despite management, we've lost the tree species. So I'd certainly support the efforts of the borough to make this policy as strong as it can possibly be, and so, well, what's the point the town council would. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on these two policies really, in 12 and 13 really? Julie Davis.
Thank you, Julie Davis, CPRE Kent, the Countryside Charity. I just wanted to skip back to policy EN 12, if I could, trees, woodland, hedges and development. And it's got a list of 8 circumstances in which special consideration will be given to trees. And as per our original representations, whether a 9th could be added, referencing Arcadian areas as cross-reference to the policy EN 17, which the council specifically defines at paragraph 6.211. Thank you.
Yes, these areas have got their own specific policy, haven't they? these, we talked about this yesterday, didn't we? These areas are defined on the policies map.
That's right. So they have a particular policy that applies to them and talks about development in those areas to assure that they're adequately protected, and where trees in those areas, individual trees or particular groups have a special contribution, they would normally be subject to a tree preservation order.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on. So we've got through EN 12, EN 13 we talked about. EN 14 then, and I think I asked a question here about the justification for seeking to protect existing green, grey and blue infrastructure. So again, what just for sort of purposes of hearing, what do you mean then by green, grey and blue infrastructure? Is that set out in the supporting text? People know what this generally means?
Sorry, so I was just trying to find the question. It's question 6, isn't it? We have defined green, grey and blue infrastructure within our glossary. But if you look also what's required in the MPPF, you can see there is an alignment there. And the need to protect existing green infrastructure is set out within the various parts of the MPPF as well. And so when reading the policy, you can cross-read to elements of the MPPF that talk about green infrastructure. And so I think that's sufficiently clear. If some further clarification is needed, we will be happy to provide it.
And within the submission plan, there was a very minor change within the, I think it's in the, where's it gone, penultimate sentence, I think. Proposals for new green, grey and blue infrastructure should aim to improve, and then there was an additional ecological, the insertion of the word ecological connectivity. What was the justification for that?
Question 6. EN 21 and EN 22 and 14. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was at the request, sir, I think, of it's either the Wildlife Trust or Natural England. I can't remember now, but it was just to make sure that because green infrastructure is important for biodiversity as much as it is for people, and so it's important to consider that in the context of green infrastructure.
Do you think by inserting the word ecological there, it then just infers that it is just ecological, or is it, like you say, is it potentially wider than that?
Green, grey and blue infrastructure may be multifunctional, which includes improved. So it's got, first of all, improved connections for people. It's got stepping stones, corridors for wildlife. Proposals for new green, grey and blue infrastructure should aim to improve ecological connectivity and be informed by and respond to. Well, that's the debate, I suppose, in terms of trying to meet the request of everybody and put it into a single policy. I don't think it'll be read like that,
What you could do, which might be a compromise, is just say proposals for new green, grey and blue infrastructure should aim to improve connectivity, brackets including ecological connectivity.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very helpful suggestion and overcomes any possible misinterpretation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, that was the only question I had on that one then. So again, sort of opening up to anybody else. Comments on policy EN14. Yeah, Mr. Lovell.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm in the right place here or not for this, but in terms of sort of green infrastructure and ensuring that it works, one of the things that we've noticed is that there hasn't been, well, given the fact that you have 2 strategic sites at either end of Capel, or small rural parish, and which will be connected by an arc of industry when the quarries are excavated, plus a road to the south. Biodiversity is going to be squeezed from either direction here, and the green infrastructure to exist, that's going to be remarkably difficult. So we're a bit concerned about, whilst it's not a legal requirement, a cumulative impact assessment wasn't done on this particular area. That would have helped not only ensure that the baseline of biodiversity was understood within the area, but also things like preserving green space and even blue, the blue sort of aspects of this, where the quarries exist. So we're not sure why that wasn't done, particularly given the importance of the strategic sites, especially when it would appear that the council does recognise that the 2 major sites actually will be independent of each other, or dependent upon each other in terms of other aspects such as commerciality and education. So, as I say, I'm not sure if I brought that up in the right place, but we do feel that a cumulative impact assessment should have been done to help inform the decision making, you know, but hasn't been. We don't really understand why that's happened.
Okay, thank you. Anything the council want to come back on?
No, thank you, sir.
Just going through the policies, I know that we talked about EN15 yesterday, local green space, but it did occur to me actually in preparing for this afternoon's session, we talked a lot yesterday about local green spaces, but in terms of the local green space policy, rereading that, the MPPF talks about local green space policies essentially being consistent with policies in relation to the green belt. And just looking at that, I wondered whether that was the case or whether policy EN15 maybe goes beyond that remit.
It does to an extent. If you compare the policy to the MPPF, it does. But the MPPF requires consistency, not an identically framed policy, and the consistency is in the spatial dimension, because the green belt policies in the MPPF relate to spatial matters, not qualitative matters that affect the environment and which qualify local green space to be recognised in policy. So there's additional elements that make it special to the community which are recognised. And so it goes beyond the spatial element. So what this policy does is recognise that particular dimension in terms of the contribution the site makes. And so that's why it's framed the way it is. And I suggest that it's entirely appropriate in those circumstances. Otherwise, we may as well just be saying local green space is green belt, but clearly that's not the intention of government in the way it's framed its policies in the MPPF, particularly with regard to this most recent of policy designations.
under the MPPF, the new certain types of development in the greenbelt are obviously inappropriate, and then you've got the very special circumstances cases. In your policy EN15, it goes straight into development will not be permitted unless the proposed development constitutes very special circumstances. Whereas policy in the MPPF would permit development that is not inappropriate. So in doing that, is there a conflict between EN15 and the framework?
I don't believe so. And let me give you an example as to why the framework uses the word consistent. Development that is not inappropriate would include limited infilling in villages. Now, quite clearly, a site that was designated as local green space could also be amenable to or suitable for development purposes, limited infilling. And its purpose, therefore, its designated purpose would be overcome or defeated by the inclusion of limited infilling as appropriate development in the greenbelt. So one has to exercise a degree of discrimination, I suggest, in framing policies that support and protect green space, having regard to the exceptions that exist in national policy. I'm not quite sure I remember how many of the local green spaces are in villages, but it's quite a substantial number. Just looking for assistance.
That's right, sir. There are a number spread about villages and so on. Criterion 3 does, in a way, say what is appropriate in terms of development on local green spaces, and whether that should be reordered in terms of, having appropriate development and inappropriate development. But it is quite clearly the case that we're trying to mirror as best we can the national policy, but make sure that if we're going to designate it as local green space for a particular interest, that interest is preserved.
What was the justification? Proposed development constitutes very special circumstances, such as essential utility infrastructure. What was the justification for sort of using that then?
So that's in the supporting text 6.184. 3/4 of the way down, these very special circumstances may include works involving new electricity pylons, natural gas, water or sewage pipes, as well as telegraph poles, telecommunication or transportation infrastructure. So we recognise that these are examples where these things can't go anywhere else. Or it's very difficult to put them anywhere else, and they have to be placed, and it may well affect a local green space.
I think probably you don't need to specify or identify those in the main body of the policy. They've been referred to as examples, but I think they don't need to be in the policy. Very special circumstances are case and fact dependent. So.
Okay. Yeah. You probably have. Again, whether you delete the bit in brackets there, it's probably not strictly necessary for soundness. It was more the issue about whether or not it was consistent with the sort of thrust of the policy. But I appreciate the point about infilling.
I actually think there's a difficulty with the MPPF in this respect. I don't think it's considered that relationship fully enough, but that's my personal observation, having looked to see how both sets of policies work. So I think it's appropriate in those circumstances for this plan, to be tailored in order to meet the objectives for local green space as set out in the MPPF, but is importing as much flexibility as the green belt policies within the MPPF import.
Okay, a slight deviation from this afternoon's topic, but worthwhile bringing it up nonetheless. And I said no one raised it yesterday, but it just cropped up as I was going through the policies this afternoon. Okay, right, where did we get to? We've gone off track. We also talked yesterday about EN20, didn't we? Let's just go back to that, EN20, which was the agricultural land policy. We talked yesterday about this policy, and again, so some very minor tweaks to wording, really, just to bring it in line with the MPPF around significant loss of land, etc. So we've already talked about that one. Did anybody wish to raise any questions, observations on this one? Yep, Julie Davis.
My apologies, I wasn't at yesterday's session, and I did have a note that I wanted just to raise something. So you may well have discussed it yesterday, and it was just a desire from the Countryside Charity that we underline the importance of agricultural land as a finite resource, and also, of course, food security in the current world situations that we find ourselves in. And specifically at paragraph 2 of the policy, where applicants are required to justify the loss of agricultural land is necessary, the applicant is required to justify why the loss of agricultural land is acceptable, and whether that could be strengthened to make it necessary, and therefore underline the importance that, really we shouldn't be seeing agricultural land lost when we need it to feed ourselves. Thank you.
Mr. Lovell.
Yeah, I was going to make a very similar point, but more specifically to Capel. All the land in this parish is best and most versatile, but this is where the council has focused its strategy. But at least one significant site has been put forward and is confirmed when the Natural England mapping is looked at as poor quality, but all manner of reasons were found to reject it. But very little reason has been given for the selection of the strategic site, where this land is not just BMV, but it's highly productive. And as was just mentioned, increasingly important to the growing threat to food security. There's indeed, in answer to this specific question that you asked, there was actually no attempt to justify the loss of 600 acres of BMV land. Is there a justification? Perhaps not. Thank you.
I think in terms of the sort of rationale for the council strategy, I think we discussed this back when we were in the council offices back in sort of May and June, and we discussed this issue, didn't we, in terms of whether or not the council had taken into account best and most versatile agricultural land in its strategic housing and economic land assessments, and whether or not you're taking into account that in terms of the sustainability appraisal as well. But just for my note, Mr. Lovell, what was the site that you were referring to? You said you referred to a site that was you said it was referred to a site that was poor quality, but it was discounted.
Oh, okay. That's specifically the site that was put forward at Castle Hill.
Okay.
That's grade 4, I believe. which is poor quality land.
Okay, yeah, and again, we discussed in depth, didn't we, on the strategy day about reasons for, council's reasons for not selecting that as a location for growth. Just in terms of the policy itself, then, so yesterday what we discussed, again, the council will correct me if I've got this wrong. It was only yesterday, so hopefully I've not. In terms of the policy, then. The main change really is that the framework, where it's referring to loss of or development of agricultural land, the framework refers to significant development of agricultural land. So where significant development of agricultural land is demonstrated to be necessary, areas of poorer quality land should be preferred. So we talked about that as a change, and we also talked about essentially the deletion of the first part of that policy, which was relating to inappropriate or unsustainable development, because that's covered by other policies. That's what the plan seeks to do through its strategy, through its strategic policies. What is inappropriate? Well, that's defined by other policies in the plan. So the policy as a whole, yes, it is, the general thrust of the policy does reflect the framework, but in terms of the specific detail, it does need to refer to significant loss of agricultural land. As you take into account the points that people have made about the strategy and the council sort of choosing its sites and how it's taken agricultural land into account, but we did talk about that sort of quite extensively at other sessions. So again, certainly points to take into account and consider going forwards. Anything else on EN20? Nope. In terms of EN21, there were some suggested changes at the submission stage then. I think the majority of these, in fact, all of these, were in the supporting text. So again, if you could just identify why these changes are necessary.
Yes, that's fine. Yes, the changes were in supporting text. That's right for these policies. So for EN21, the changes were brought about by a comment that suggesting that there's two changes actually in EN21, the supporting text. The first change was from a comment suggesting that the policy would benefit from setting out a timescale for lowering nitrogen oxides from heating systems during the plan period, to recognise that we need to continue improving air quality as time goes on. The council responded by confirming that the standard that we're using, it is currently considered to be good practice, and I think we were mindful at the time that there's a lot of change on the horizon with Future Homes Standard currently planned for implementation in 2025, which will not permit any more installations of gas boilers in development. So we didn't think a change to the policy was necessary, but we thought perhaps in the supporting text it might be useful just to re-emphasize that we are following a good practice, current good practice on that. And then the second change to the supporting text was one for clarity in paragraph 6250. A respondent pointed out that we are unintentionally, of course, suggesting that pollutants should be maintained at unacceptable levels, which was not our intention. So we've just taken out the phrase to improve and maintain levels of air pollutants and replaced it with to secure safe levels of air pollutants.
And again, just in terms of sort of heating systems then and sort of gas-fired boilers, again, what's the council going to do then? How's it going to sort of achieve these requirements, or is it actually is it more a sort of aim to provide or seek to provide Or again, is this something that you're actually actively requiring developers to do?
Yeah, it is a requirement. It's quite a simple small scale mitigation measure that we implement on all schemes. And it comes under the generic air quality policy, the EN21, rather than one that focuses in on air quality management areas. And it's coupled with a couple of other sort of quite small scale measures, such as the installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure and appropriate cycle storage facilities.
So just on that then, just on the electric vehicle charging points, so this is policy EN21. It says, in the interest of improving air quality, all relevant development. So what development does this relate to?
Well, any development that's installing a heating system.
So in terms of the electric vehicle charging, then what
well, the council has a guidance note on electric vehicle charging points for new development, which is in line with the new building regs, which has a number of different development types and suggested thresholds for electric vehicle charging infrastructure points and cabling as well. So that's fairly clearly laid out in the guidance note.
So again, just going back to the local plan then, is it clear to a developer when they need to provide electric vehicle charging infrastructure, be it residential or non-residential? So if I was a developer and I'm designing my scheme, how do I know then whether or not I need to provide electric vehicle charging points?
Well, the policy directs applicants to the electric vehicle charging infrastructure guidance note. So I think it's clear that they need to look at this. It's within the policy box. And then they'll find that table I was talking about, and they can compare their own development with the thresholds within that and establish what they need to provide.
Is that something that's available? Is that part of the examination in the library?
No, it's not in the library, but there is a hyperlink within the plan itself.
I wonder whether, and again, just thinking out loud really here, I wonder whether this needs to be within the plan itself in terms of, again, it's just going back to that, if you're requiring applicants to provide electric vehicle charging points, and again, entirely appropriate to be promoting that, it's just making it abundantly clear, you know, I've got a scheme of 3 houses, do I need to do it? As it stands, I don't really know. Or again, if you've got, you know, a sort of flatted development, is there some sort of communal sort of charging bays that you need to provide? Or if you've got a retail scheme, again, you know, how many spaces do you need to provide? So whether or not that could just be made clearer.
Are you suggesting in the supporting text? Or because it's quite a long and involved table, it might overwhelm the content.
In terms of the obvious ones then, so residential development, what does the guidance require then? So sort of each dwelling presumably, I don't know, sort of has cabling within a garage or something. What do you provide?
Yes, or just off the top of my head, I'd have to look it up, but it's all private dwellings with off-road parking have to provide a charge point, and that becomes more onerous the bigger the developments get. So I think it's major developments are required to provide 10% of parking spaces with EV charge points, and there's a requirement for cabling as well. Sorry, I'd have to look it up to be sure.
Okay, leave it with me, because I appreciate the point that I've just had a quick look at that document, and yeah, it is quite lengthy, and there's obviously lots of details requirements in there, which you wouldn't necessarily want to put in the local plan. But equally, I just think where it says all relevant development, perhaps could be just tightened up to make it clear. But yeah, leave that one with me then. But I think probably does need to be a change there just to make it clearer,
Sure,
and effective. And I'll think about what the best way of doing that is. And presumably this is something the council is the council doing this already then? Is that guidance note being used? Is it causing any problems? Is it working well? Causing conflict?
It is working well. It's just ambitious enough to challenge developers, but not overly ambitious. So we're managing to get most schemes with the appropriate thresholds. Yeah.
Okay.
And we've been using a number of years as well. Yeah.
Okay, any comments then on either EN21 or EN22, which is all about air quality?
I just had one further thing, actually, a point of clarification. Since the submission local plan was published, we've declared a second AQMA. So the supporting text in 6254 and 6256 needs an update. At the time of writing that, the AQME hadn't been declared, but it was declared in December 2021. So we just need to bring that up to date.
Yeah, okay, agree with that. Ms. Davis?
Oops. Just looking for a minor wording addition actually to EN21, the last paragraph where there's a list of example of sustainable transport measures. You can read along the first line of that, and it talks about cycle/footways. We also add in and public rights of way? Obviously, these are quite often off-road and enabling users to go along routes that aren't along the roadside and therefore have less pollution and quite possibly may even be quicker routes to use. Thank you.
Yes, I have no problem with that. That's fine.
Yeah, fine. Any other comments? No. Okay. Yeah. So quality management areas. Let's see in 22. And we'll come back to yeah, we've got EN23 biomass. We'll come back to that. Just in terms of question 9 within the matters, issues and questions, noise and vibration policy. Again, I think that was just another requirement of something according with an SPD. So it's, again, we don't need to go over that. I think you know what you need to do, and the council sort of committed to looking at the plan as a whole to pick up any of these sort of in accordance with SPD type issues.
Yeah, we've got that, sir. Thank you.
Okay, it's got to 3:30. Oh, Ms. Davis.
Sorry, I just forgot to take my hand down. I haven't got anything else to add.
Oh, that's okay. Mr. Scully.
Thank you, sir. I'm just conscious we didn't discuss EN10. What we referenced in our statement, matter 15, question 1, a couple of minor mods to do with firstly adding in geodiversity to our schedule as a correction, and secondly to just clarify local nature recovery strategies as the correct term, because there's been a few terms bandied about, and wanted to make sure it's consistent. So with your permission, sir, we'll make those suggested mods as well. They're in the statement.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? They're in the statement. Yeah. Mr. Lovell.
Yes, thanks, sir. I just wanted to mention something that cropped up this morning. I was listening in, and there's a very important point that I'd like to raise, as there are clear links to environment and climate change. The council said that they were sticking to a 20% carbon reduction in development rather than demanding an increase to 35%. However, we estimate that the 12,000 houses being built borough-wide will create nearly 1 million, or generate 1 million tonnes of greenhouse gas. So even if the figure of carbon reduction per dwelling were reduced to 50%, the damage to the climate and the environment will be absolutely staggering. To lessen that damaging impact, there needs to be a greater focus on brownfield and repurposing as core strategies. Refurbishing a house, for example, reduces the carbon generated to only 8 tonnes, a tenth of the amount caused by a new build. Destruction of greenfield is very evidently the most environmentally damaging type of construction. And to pursue it as the core strategy, we believe is irresponsible. So I'm pleased to see that the council now, with a change of leadership from which championed this local plan, is finally grasping what Safe Capel has been trying to say, and is now proposing development of car parks and repurposing of empty office and commercial space. It needs to do more and refocus this deeply unpopular local plan. I think you've seen many people from across the borough coming in to bemoan what's happening. And it needs to look towards brownfield and urban regeneration to produce a modern plan that protects the environment and that can carry public support. At the moment, this plan doesn't do it. So I just thought, if I had the chance, I would bring that up, sir.
Okay, thank you. Points noted. Okay, there's 2 more issues to go through and a handful of questions, but I propose we'll take a break. We'll have a mid-afternoon break, and then we'll come back, and there's just the sort of, I think, EN23. There's the sort of former landfill site and some of the flooding policies to go through, and that'll be it. So we'll have a break. So again, don't log out, just turn cameras and microphones off. We'll have an adjournment, and we'll return at 3:45, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. It's 3:45, so we'll resume and continue. We got as far as issue 3 then, which is biomass and renewable technology. So looking at policy EN 23, biomass technology. If I just ask the council just to just briefly explain what the purpose and the justification for this policy is, please.
Sure. So this policy was set against the backdrop of the air quality policies that are prior to it in the plan. And the aim is simply to continue to improve and maintain good air quality in line with paragraph 186. The emphasis was on ensuring biomass is not installed in unsuitable locations in the borough. And we felt a specific policy was justified, as there's a fair amount of technical detail related to biomass installations and plant, which wouldn't have been relevant in either of the previous 2 policies for most developers. So it was kept as a separate policy.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute then. Any comments on this one in particular then? See, very specific policy relating to biomass technology. No. Okay, we'll move on. The next item on the matters, issues and questions was the former North Farm landfill site, but let's just skip over that for now. I want to come back to that just because we've been obviously taking these environmental policies in order, so we may as well just continue because there's only I think EN 24, 5 and 6 left. So let's continue going through these, and then we can go back to that particular allocation. So this is issue 4 then, again looking at the sort of water and flood risk. Question number 1 was relating to policy EN 24, and this has been a theme throughout, again, several of these, certainly the strategic site allocations, about concerns that the certainly larger allocations would exacerbate or have implications for existing wastewater treatment. Obviously, we've seen correspondence from Southern Water in particular. But what does policy EN 24 then do? And it might be worthwhile if the council could just explain for others at the hearing. What does EN 24 do then to ensure that development is either prevented or restricted or delayed until the necessary infrastructure is actually put in place?
Hello, Sharon Evans on behalf of Tunbridge Wells Borough Council. So as we set out in our statement, policy EN 24 does deal with water supply, quality, conservation, and the starting point in the policy is that all development must ensure that there is or will be adequate water supply and wastewater treatment facilities in place to serve the whole development, including all phases where applicable. And this is a policy that we've discussed with the relevant bodies. We've set out in our statement how we've had ongoing liaison with Southern Water throughout the process, and I think sort of Southern Water in the main is who you're referring to in terms of wastewater infrastructure. And you'll find the information set out within our infrastructure delivery plan that supports the local plan, the ongoing liaison that we've had with Southern Water. And we've also got a statement of common ground with them as well, where they've supported this policy. And I know that we've had discussions on individual site allocations where Southern Water made comments on those individual allocations, but they agreed, we agreed that the approach, it was made more sense to have an overarching policy EN 24 that would deal with that. And there's cross references to the various site allocations to this policy to ensure that the relevant infrastructure is in place.
Yeah, and again, obviously, in 24 it says, obviously, where necessary, occupation development is to be phased to align with the delivery of sewage infrastructure in liaison with the service provider. So presumably, again, that's where upgrades are needed, and development would come forward and be restricted then in parcels, phases, etc. Ms. Riley?
Hang on a second. I'm not sure where else to raise this. But the Town Council are very concerned that issues regarding building in areas of flood risk have not been addressed by policy in the draft local plan. The Council are unduly reliant upon their strategic flood risk assessments rather than having clear detailed policies that make clear to developers what is required to mitigate the flooding. In the Reg 18 representations, the Town Council submitted a parcel by parcel analysis of flood risk and also a critique of the information provided in the strategic flood risk assessments and all the technical appendices that were attached to those. No specific floodwater storage measures, attenuation features or flood defences for the development parcels or indeed the adjacent areas of town are provided. Such modelling as exists was done on each individual parcel, and at no point is there an assessment of the impact on the existing areas of the town of the cumulative allocations. Within each parcel, the modelling shows an increase in predicted flood depths, which must surely increase the flood risk, contrary to the NPPF and planning policy guidance. The Town Council also pointed out many factual errors in the SFRA, such as confusion between the names of rivers, such as referring to the River Bolt, which is not at no point within the borough, never mind Paddock Wood, thus calling into doubt the accuracy of modelling at that date, and the data that had been inputted by the consultants. At no point has any response to these submissions and the Town Council's repetition of them under Reg 18 as part of the hearings process being forthcoming. This is very disappointing and leads the Town Council to feel that the many hours of work scrutinising the information provided was wasted time. At this point, the best outcome on this matter that Town Council can hope for is that the Council be required to amend the plan to include specific, comprehensive and detailed measures on a parcel-by-parcel basis for the allocations over and above basic subs, so it is clear to developers exactly what they will be expected to collectively provide to make the allocations sound. There is regular surface water flooding, including sewage overflows already in Paddock Wood, and the concern is that if development is not managed properly, this will worsen and affect a wider area. To stress again, I cannot find any flood policy anywhere in this plan, and trust me, I have searched and I have hunted for it. I cannot see where in policy these huge strategic allocations on areas subject to flood risk are mitigated for. There just simply isn't enough detail, and the SFRAs are just ridden with faults and errors that we've pointed out now 3 times, and no one's listening. And we're as a Town Council, we're very frustrated by this. So I hope you'll take this into account.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so obviously allow the council to come back on this. I appreciate that on the Paddock Wood Day we did talk about flooding, and obviously so Mr. Hayes on behalf of the Town Council has raised this on several occasions as well in terms of the strategic flood risk assessments, the work that's been done, the adequacy of that, and we talked in detail, didn't we, about how the flooding would be. Or how the flooding is proposed to be controlled, and we talked about sort of water flows and the issues around the railway line and culverts, etc. But was there anything the council wanted to add at this stage in addition to that? Presumably policy EN25 applies as well then.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Overarching policy on flood risk, that would still apply to allocations.
Yes, it would, sir. I don't think there's anything we need to add. The SFRA work was a subject of consultation, and it's been a major matter which has been given full consideration by the council and it's been up for consultation. I don't think there's anything we can add to what was discussed at the earlier sessions.
Yeah, and I would stress, obviously, we have discussed this across the sessions and well aware of the Town Council's concerns, not only in relation to right at that beginning level of selecting sites and an application of the sequential test, which Mr. Hayes pointed out all the way through to the discussion we had on the day about looking at the parcels and how they're going to work and issues, and I think I obviously ask questions of the council on that day about exactly what would be proposed, what is going to happen. Mr. Gledhill.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted, I'm not going to repeat what's been covered before, but sticking with EN24, I think little opportunity has been given in the examination so far, sir, to the important aquifer Heart Lake, which is just at the northern edge, if you like, of the Tudley Village site. We didn't really get a lot of time to discuss it on Tudley Day. Or elsewhere. And I just want you to be aware, sir, of how significant that aquifer is and the risks upon it. If one, particularly at Tudley Village, the higher ground, of course, we've talked about the potential risk of contaminated significant runoff towards the Medway. But in that higher ground underneath, there's quite significant underground natural springs, which will seriously hamper construction. North of the railway, the land proposed does sit right over the aquifer. So again, that comes into play there. And in terms of East Capel, it's another, being so low lying and part of the floodplain itself. The water table is incredibly high, and I note the policy says work beneath the water table would not be permitted unless etc. And that brings me on to the point really that in the absence of a proper drainage plan at this stage, which has been covered before, sir, but I just bring reference back to it in the context of this policy. And then I do have other comments on flood risk generally, but I just wanted to stick to the EN24 point at this point.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from the council then on those particular points?
Yes, so just to point out in relation to the policy, you'll see paragraphs in the supporting text 6.266 and 6.267. So we do recognise the importance of protecting groundwater resources and the aquifers, and there are aquifer protection zones in place. And the second part of the policy, as was pointed out, deals with these kind of issues in relation to underground water resources.
Okay, any other points, Mr. Gledhill? You said you had some further points to raise. Was that in relation to policy EN25 then, which is relating to flood risk?
Yes, sir. Yeah, and again, I'm conscious of trying to avoid repeating what the arguments have been made. But let's not forget that the core strategy is fundamentally to build on the area most at risk of flooding in the whole borough. And the Medway floodplain is the second largest in the country. And that point should not be lost. And in the context of these policies, Safe Capel, as we set out in our Reg 19 submission, does support many of these EN policies. They have very sound and laudable objectives. However, if one looks at the plan as a whole, if you look at these policies as against the strategic sites, for example, there seems to be a direct conflict and a massive risk for the council going forward, in that if any of these policies are fail when one considering a particular site, then that invalidates the plan. And there's a huge risk here of inconsistency of these very important subsidiary policies against the fundamental policies at the strategic sites. And the evidence base has not been provided at the time of submission. And you've heard from us on that before. But it does seem to me that we are at a situation with a council running with a plan that when it submitted it, it did not feel it had enough evidence, because it carried on working with National Highways, KCC, etc., to try and get further evidence, whilst also saying that there's a need for proportionality. So there's a dichotomy here where clearly leaving details to the SPD processes has already been discussed as being perhaps not the best approach. But it does leave us in a position as a community wondering why the council continues to try and justify this plan when it goes against all the principles that it's setting out in these other policies. And I won't repeat those arguments, but I think it's worth considering that. And I'd make one specific further point on the Paddock Wood strategic site development. And I note there's representation from JBA. We studied their strategic assessment back in 2019 at length and produced our own report, which you'll have seen, sir. And it was considered by JBA that the best way of mitigating the flood risk by developing East Capel was to create a reservoir south of the railway line within the parcel. But it also considered the effectiveness of that and proposed storage up Colts Hill, which would have greatly improved the situation on the Badsall Road and near the roundabout, and those proposals were put in at Reg 18, but then they were removed. And now we have a situation, sir, where the work done by David Locke has proposed relatively minor mitigation within this development site, and yet is building something in the region of 600 houses on the flood zone. And when viewed against a buffer of 1,200, it brings me back to the point: why are we building so many houses at the greatest flood risk?
Okay, thank you. Anything in response from the council?
No, again, sir, these are matters which we have already addressed at length in previous sessions. Thank you.
Okay, just looking at the policies in particular, the EN24 and EN25 then. EN24 we talked about, and that's ensuring there's an appropriate mechanism to sort of control development. EN25, question 2 then. So is policy EN25 consistent with national planning policy, which states that application for some minor developments and change of use should not be subject to sequential and exception tests, but in some cases should still meet the requirements for a site-specific flood risk assessment? And I think there's some suggested changes here as well.
Yes, we've dealt with this in our response to question 2 in the statement. You will see that we made some amendments to the supporting text to this policy at paragraph 6.279 and also at 6.278. But we've said in our statement, if it was felt necessary, then we could consider some amended wording to the policy itself.
I think that's fine. 6.279, isn't it? There, in the maybe instance where it's appropriate to require a flood risk assessment for small developments, and that would be appropriate to consult with KCC's lead local flood authority on a case-by-case basis. And I think that adequately covers the point. Just just more widely then in terms of policy EN 25 on flood risk, and also EN 26 on drainage then. Any comments or questions or queries from anybody? I think these policies largely reflect national planning policy and their requirements, flood risk assessments, sort of sequential exception tests, etc. Again, obviously you can look at the detailed wording, just again, any consequential changes or similar changes to policies that we've been talking about. But I didn't have anything further, so open to other people if they had any comments around EN 26, which is sustainable drainage, or EN 25, which is the flood risk. Also, the council have confirmed that these policies would apply in all cases, including sites allocated in a plan. Nope. Okay, we'll go back now, because I said we thought it would go back. Just bear me 1 second before we do EN 27 noise. We've already talked about. There was a question on that, and the main question I had there was, again, it's the sort of in accordance with the SPD point that we've picked up. Land contamination, there's a question around that as well. So again, if anybody has any questions on any of these policies, again, my comments have largely been picked up by the council's statements and sort of commitments, having a look at the wording again around things like SPDs. If not, we will go back then to the allocation at RTW18, which is the former North Farm landfill site. So what is this allocation then? What's it based on, and is it justified and effective? Is it going to sort of come forward within the plan period?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So this site is actually allocated for two types of use, either renewable energy technology or sports, recreation and leisure uses. It's been allocated in this sense because there have been two departments in KCC planning for this site for a while. It's owned by KCC. This is a former TIP. So initially, when we were first drafting the policy, KCC was indicating that they were keen on leisure uses. The type of leisure is quite restricted because of a very steep topography there, but I think a dry ski slope was mentioned. And then later on, a different department in KCC informed us that they had plans to build a solar farm on the site. Now that the solar farm feels like it's more likely at this stage, but KCC hasn't yet secured funding or grid connections. So there is an element of risk. So the council felt it appropriate to allocate for both uses, not simultaneously, but an either or approach at the moment.
So just in terms of the sort of sport, recreation, leisure uses, what uses are envisaged? And so that's quite a sort of wide range there. So what is actually envisaged?
So this would be the potential for a dry ski slope that was discussed. Although we have discussed this with KCC, and the department that's pushing forward with the solar farm plans have indicated that the solar farm also wouldn't necessarily rule out a sort of informal walking use of the site, because the panels are planned for the northern end only. So it would be factored into a planning application, which they're hoping to submit next year.
So is it fair to say that that's the more likely outcome then?
Yes, that's our view at the moment. They whatever use it takes, that there are a lot of remedial works required before it can be done, and that's happening right now. A tender stage is finished, and there'll be some works beginning in September to improve the gas pipe work there and install a geosynthetic clay liner, because there's some leachate that comes from the site during heavy rain. These remedial works need doing first, but in terms of deliverability, it's very much on track. So their plan is to gear up for a planning application next year.
Just in terms of the leisure use, I'm just mindful that on the day where we talked about employment, on the adjacent employment site, we talked about unintended sort of dangers of allocating things for leisure uses. I just wonder whether the same thing applies here, by just having the reference to just just leisure use. Let me just see what the policy says. Obviously, I know, and it sounds unlikely, but given what we talked about on the previous sessions, it's just seeking to guard against the sort of unintended allocation of the site for leisure, as in a main town centre use, which isn't, I don't think, what it's far from what you envisage. Because then if a leisure development did come forward, then it's an allocated site for leisure. You wouldn't have to consider sequential and things like that. Yeah. Excuse me.
So I think that's unlikely a sort of a wider unintended use, because of the actual very nature of the sites in terms of either venting gases, but also the topography of the site. There could potentially be other leisure uses, such as sort of various types of bike tracks and so on, that might fit within the policy. But also there is a criterion 4 that the development does not result in unacceptable landscape impacts as well. So that's and it requires a landscape and visual impact assessment. And also this is immediately adjacent to the waste management facility, which is quite a considerable structure, with the associated noise and odours and so on. So I think it's a pragmatic policy for the things that are likely to come forward.
So I think it'd be very simple just to specify that the energy, sport and recreation and leisure uses are outdoor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, that was the only comment I had on it, really, which is just further to discussions we had the other day. So I think that is every policy we've gone through. Let me just double check. I think it is. So was there any other policies then that either anybody here today wished to speak about, or likewise from the council? I think we've actually probably ended up discussing every single policy in the plan, one way or another. I didn't have any further questions. I think that concludes all of the matters, issues and questions. Obviously tomorrow we've got a reserve session where we're sort of coming back to the Turned Farm scheme. But at this stage, on anything else from the council?
No, thank you very much, sir.
No, and no. From other participants? No. Also appreciate that some participants have been here for pretty much nearly every session. So appreciate that. Thank you for your time and input. I know these examinations can be sort of lengthy and time consuming and resource intensive. So no, appreciate everybody's input and certainly thank you for your time. and input both when we're in the council offices and also on these virtual sessions. So yeah, certainly appreciate that. Lots for me to obviously go away and consider, and also to get out on site and look at some of these issues in greater detail on site. Just in terms of that, where possible, I think I've said this at previous sessions, where possible, I'll do site visits on an unaccompanied basis, just because it's easier. But where access does need to be taken onto allocations, whether in private land, and I feel that that's necessary, then they'll be arranged through the programme officer. Mr. Gledhill, questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes, you'll be aware that, it's 4.5 months since we kicked this off on the 1st of March. We have been, Safe Cable has been engaged throughout the process, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to participate. On behalf of our thousands of supporters, many of whom will be watching this back, can you give an indication on timescales, just to give the public, given this a public consultation, some idea of what they could expect when, roughly? I appreciate a lot of things are still up in the air and site visits and so forth, but just some indication for the public.
Yes, obviously we've talked about a lot of modifications to the plan. Some issues I need to go away and carefully consider, and obviously having the benefit of site visits to do that. What are we now in middle of July? I envisage probably by the, it's difficult to say. I hate to give timescales because you never know what's going to happen. But I am envisaging getting back down to Tunbridge Wells, back down to the borough as soon as I can after these hearings, and arranging the site visits. Obviously, that's dependent upon where I need to gain access, arranging various site visits with participants, and then committing to writing to the council on some of the issues that either result out of those site visits, or some of the issues that were left unresolved on some of the policies and issues. So I can't give a definitive answer. All I can say is, I imagine that would probably happen, within the next 4 to 6 weeks. After the close of the hearings, where there's a lot to get through. This is a big plan. It's over 500 pages long, so there's a lot to get through. But yeah, I certainly would envisage to commit to writing to the council on any outstanding matters, certainly within the next 4 to 6 weeks. Hopefully that sort of helps. And just by just by way of sort of future, what happens with the examination thereafter, it sort of depends on, there's a lot of things for me to go away and consider. If, for example, we got into a situation where I said to the council, okay, you need to do X, Y, and Z to make the plan sound, then there would be sort of probably a period of time where the council would have to come up with the wording of any necessary changes. And we've already, to be fair, discussed some quite, in places, some quite comprehensive changes to wording. So there needs to be a period of time for the council to come up with that wording and agree it with myself. And then that would go out to full public consultation. So that would be full public consultation in the same way as the Regulation 19 consultation. So that would be for 6 weeks, minimum of 6 weeks. So so I think in the immediate sort of future, for myself to obviously consider the issues, get out on site, have a look at some of these issues, and then obviously commit to write to the council on any outstanding matters as soon as possible thereafter, probably within the next sort of 4 to 6 weeks, if not sooner. And then where any further changes are needed to the plan, then it would be process for the council to sort of work through those changes, and then it would be subject to full public consultation. So probably I would imagine that would be end of summer, autumn time for that to start. hopefully that gives a sort of summary. But again, it really is dependent upon me obviously going away and considering some of these issues and actually looking at them. Is that sufficiently clear, Mr. Cledell? I know it's not a sort of a definitive data or anything, but hopefully it gives a general steer as to where the examination's going.
Yeah, I think that's I'm very grateful to you, because I think we need to update our supporters, of course, because the hearings have come to a close and it's kind of a point at which we need to look forward. I hear you. I think probably what you're saying is the main modifications consultation will probably conclude towards the end of the year, before Christmas. And thereafter, we're looking at the council possibly still moving to adopt before March. Is that still on track? Because that's kind of the objective that was set out a few months ago.
I think so. And obviously, I'll let the council jump in at any stage, because presumably within the council, there's various processes to go through to agree, publication of main modifications, and there may well be sort of committee cycles that they need to go through to agree to start public consultation exercises, etc. So there may be lead-in times for various members, presumably to make decisions on when things like that start. But no, the main modification process would be a 6-week public consultation. Generally, there's quite a lot of work that goes into that. We've talked about, there's a lot of policies in this plan, and we've talked about some changes to them. There's mapping changes to go with it. There's obviously necessary changes to sustainability appraisal, etc. So it's not a necessarily quick process, but it would be in the council's sort of hands to progress that and agree dates for consultation. I don't know whether the council wants to add anything further in terms of their own internal processes.
I don't think so at this stage, sir, and things are very much up in the air, and we have to await your formal decision on all aspects of the plan, and we'll see where we go. Clearly, we have to follow very strict procedures, and for those third parties who are not aware, if we do get to modification stage, that process has to be conducted extremely carefully and with full public consultation, and be accompanied with updated sustainability appraisals. So I think the overall timescale is probably about right, assuming we get through those stages. But I don't think there's anything further we can add at the moment.
And obviously, even then, just so people are aware who maybe aren't familiar with the process. So once the public consultation has ended on any changes that are necessary to the plan, all those comments then come back. Obviously, they go back to the council in the first instance, and then they come back to myself. So, quite often with local plans, there's a good level of interest with this local plan, that it follows that there'd be a potentially significant number of further representations. So I then obviously have to go through that process of considering those representations as well. So even when the main modification consultation process ends, that the main modification process isn't the end of my consideration of the examination. It's parts of it, and people's representations will be taken into account at that stage as well. So it's so that's still an important part of the examination. Okay, anything else from anybody? Nope.
Thank you, sir.
No. Okay, well, as I said, so thank you all for your time. For those of you who aren't attending tomorrow, I know it's obviously a very specific session on an individual site. So again, thank you for your time and input into the sessions. And for the council and their team, I will see you tomorrow. It's a 10 o'clock start tomorrow. And again, I think Charlotte's circulated the relevant links already. So we'll adjourn for today, and then the hearings will continue from 10 o'clock tomorrow.